Who's going to be our first speaker, and he'll say a few words about Ralph, and we'll work our way through the program.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to be able to speak about Ralph in this setting. I'll be brief. I'll outline for you three things that struck me about Ralph. First, a little bit of background. I came to Duke in 1992. I was actually hired by Ralph in 1991. I was impressed immediately when I met him by the fact that he was such an accomplished person, yet he was so warm, kind, and accommodating. He wanted to hear more from me about what I was interested in rather than tell me all about himself. So he was really a man who wanted to hear from other people, which is an important quality in all aspects of life, but especially in medicine. The first thing I would say about Ralph is to emphasize his success in the face of adversity. As an example, you saw that he was an All-American basketball player. He was a great basketball player at West Virginia. What you may not know is what Ralph told me, that in that era, 1947, 1948, a lot of the players on his team and other teams were in college under the GI Bill. So here was Ralph, 17 or 18 years old, playing against 24 and 25-year-old players, some of whom made it through Guadalcanal or the Battle of the Bulge and so on. These were hardened veterans. They were rough players, according to Ralph. That was a tough environment. Some people might have quit. They might have said, I thought I was really good, but I guess I'm not so good. But Ralph's, motto, I would say, was to succeed in the face of adversity. And many times he would say to me when we were colleagues at Duke, this is going to be tough, but we've got to do it. And when he set his mind to do things, he almost always accomplished what he wanted. So that's the first lesson that I bring home from Ralph, and that it is something that I think he has taught many of the trainees at Duke. So I worked with Ralph for basically the last 15 years of his professional life. Another thing I came to learn about Ralph through his stories, but also reading articles he had written and so on, was that Ralph was a real innovator. And I think you can tell from the list of accomplishments that were outlined in that nice presentation that Ralph knew how to solve problems. He was the sort of person who would identify a problem and sometimes hear about solutions in an offhanded way and seize upon them and use the information that someone just had glibly mentioned to solve the problem that he was trying to face. And an example that I gave yesterday when we had a nice memorial at Duke was someone was complaining to Ralph that every time I stick a catheter in the artery here in the arm, the brachial artery, I wind up getting into a certain artery, the vertebral artery. And Ralph said, that's the artery I can never get in on my own, so I'm going to start using that technique. And he perfected that technique. What you may not realize is that Ralph, through his innovation, affected many, many neuroradiologists across the world, who then have taught other radiologists how to do these procedures. So the ripple effect of Ralph's innovation is very, very wide. And finally, let me just mention as part of the innovation, when Ralph was chair at University of Pittsburgh in the early 70s, and he was only 39 or 40 years old when he began there, Ralph was actually one of the most important radiologists in America, because Ralph had 2 of the 5 CAT scanners, which were revolutionary. For once, you could actually see brain tissue. And so, having looked at Ralph's CV, I was amazed by how many lectures he gave in the early 1970s across the country. Most people had never seen a CAT scan image of the brain. There weren't even textbooks at that time. So Ralph was the person who introduced the world, basically, to this technique and helped develop it over the years. Many times during my 15 years association with Ralph, I would say, well, why don't we try this? And he would say, well, we could try it, but we tried that in 1972 using X. We tried that in 87 using Z, but yeah, let's try it using a new technique. So to have someone with such a bounty of historical knowledge was such a benefit to young trainees and young faculty. And then the final point I want to make about Ralph is that he understood how to get the best out of people, and the way that he did it was to be patient and kind and nurturing. Now, medicine can be a pretty rough field, and when Ralph was training in the 50s and 60s, it was notoriously rough. Don't forget that Ralph was in surgery before he went into radiology, and that is really was and probably still is a rough and tumble world. You have to succeed or against great odds. But Ralph took the opposite approach. He wasn't tough on trainees. He would challenge them, but in a nice way. And he was very nurturing to me and to many other individuals in this room, and he formed our careers. And he not only taught us neuroradiology, he taught us how to deal with people. Not many people can offer all those services, and so for that, I'm very grateful for him. So those are my recollections. Those are the most important things that I bring home about Ralph. There are sides of Ralph that you may have experienced, but not in a medical setting. You may have only known him late in his career. But I thought it was important to show you how much he has affected the health of millions throughout his career, and how beneficial he has been to the training of many physicians during his career at Duke and before Duke. So thank you for allowing me this opportunity to speak. And now I think Tad will be giving a reading.
So good morning, and thank you for coming, of course. So Dr. Provenzale has spoken about his professional relationship with my dad, and then, of course, as a son and as a surgeon, I've had a, somewhat different view. I recognize the accomplishments, but have, of course, had influence from, very young up. There were some things that stuck with me that spoke to being an advocate of fitness and persistence. I'm thinking back to my brother and I being encouraged to do a running and sport camp at Emory University in the summer, and at about age 8 and 10 or 7 and 9, to get our reckless energy out and find something that we could enjoy and be good at and stick to over time. That's, led me to be a lifelong runner and triathlete at one point, and still very active in skiing and such. Went to a Quaker camp in Vermont that was the same sort of theme, get out, do things, don't worry about getting a little scratched up and a little dirty. I think it's already been mentioned, but of course the Second World War was quite a big deal going on in my dad's young life, and he would refer to the Bataan Death March as obviously a horrible, terrible thing, but where a soldier's commitment, grit, tenacity, and ability to persevere would allow that person to survive that march. So that was, I think, a goal for each of us kids, to be tough enough to survive some pretty terrible things, whatever that might be. My dad was not very religious formally, but certainly I think he did agree with that Quaker idea that there was an element of God in each person that you could recognize, but formal church, not so important. Much more a church of self-reliance, being prepared, working hard. I think that but that commitment to playing basketball was a good example, where he would, practice by the hour, shooting layups and jump shots and so on, to get good enough to play with these rough and tumble college age, but veteran players later on. He was also, quite ambitious, leaving South Charleston as the first college graduate in his family, and then ultimately, of course, medical school and neuroradiology. So that was already a big extension behind the achievements of his father, who was an engineer and, of course, had aspirations for his son, but wasn't able to do those things himself. He was very committed to his friends, as I'm sure some of you well know, very good about keeping up, making an effort to be in contact and letting people know what was going on, also reaching out if he knew they were having difficulties or troubles. And then finally, I was always impressed that his interests all throughout life, but especially more recently, were so widespread in different books that we would read and discuss. He had this very important book club that meant an awful lot to him, that was, would explore all sorts of topics. It's interesting that he started out being more of a liberal Democrat and ended up being a more conservative Republican, but people do drink the Kool-Aid and can't really help that. So as an influence on me, I was not encouraged or pushed to do medicine. I did choose to do medicine and then surgery, plastic surgery, and have been in private practice for about the last 22 or 3 years in Colorado. It was one of those things that, as you become a professional in the same field as, say, a parent, you see a situation where you kind of may say ultimately, especially after I worked at the University of Alabama for a few years in the late 1990s, I don't know that I want to compete with this guy. My dad has put up a pretty big tower of accomplishment, and I did feel, for lots of reasons, but I did realize early on this was probably not a very fruitful course, was to try to compete by being a more accomplished academic surgeon. So I've enjoyed plastic surgery as a community-based surgeon, and that's been just great. I wanted to read a poem by Dylan Thomas that speaks about transition and somewhat about the competitiveness of my dad. He really had a pretty intense commitment to whatever he was doing, wanted to have control over his life, be at his best as much of the time as he could. So that poem goes like this: "Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at the close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words have forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bag. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight and learned too late they grieved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my Father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." So thank you very much.
It's hard to follow Dylan Thomas. My name's John Staddon, and I'm an old friend of Ralph's, and I'm going to read this so I don't run off too long. Ralph was an extraordinary man, not just his height, athleticism, and clinical genius, but in what he had to overcome. I first met Ralph at a party given by a colleague, Dr. David Robertson, then chair of anatomy, at Duke some 35 years ago. We remained friends since then, sharing common interests in science and classical liberalism, not Kool-Aid, though. Ralph started a small conservative book group with a handful of friends 15 or so years ago. No one seems sure when. It continues still and currently includes Bob Glass, Colin Crossman, Bob Shibley, Peter Morecambe, and myself. The longevity of the group is not unrelated to the infrequency of our meetings, just 3 or 4 a year. But the main factor was Ralph. He loved to study and always came well prepared with copious notes. Ralph knew he was going to die soon and insisted we meet at his house with his family just 3 days before his death. Books we read or considered reading include Neil Ferguson's The Great Degeneration, The Camp of the Saints by Jean Raspail, The Silence of Animals by John Gray, a biography of Edmund Burke by Jesse Norman, David Horowitz's Progressive Racism, The Coddling of the American Mind by Bob Shibley's colleague Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt, Steve Pinker's Enlightenment Now, and most recently, License to Lie by Sidney Powell, which described the dishonesty of the Justice Department in destroying accounting firm Arthur Anderson and Senator Ted Stevens in connection with the Enron scandal. This is rather a contemporary book because Judge Sullivan, who was one of the relative good guys, has just re-entered the Mueller fray. Ralph was working on an autobiography right up until his death. He asked me to comment on some of it, which I was very happy to do. I retain copies of many files from what looks to me like an almost completed work. A couple of quotes may help give you a picture of the man, and so I'll just quote a couple of pieces. He grew up in Charleston, West Virginia, as you by now know. This is a quote now from Ralph. In the early 1930s, South Charleston was a small blue-collar industrial town on the narrow strip of flat land between the giant Union Carbide plant on the Kanawha River and the foothills a mile away to the south. South Charleston, like Montgomery and Charleston, lay at intervals along the Kanawha River like many other industrialized river towns. The companies were positioned there to utilize the huge reserves of natural gas, coal, and water. One would see several coal-filled 6 to 8 barge flotillas plowing down the river each day. These resources were the treasure that made the valley attractive to chemical firms from all over the country. Union Carbide, DuPont, Owens-Illinois, and other chemical companies along the river found the valley congenial for the creation of chemical products. He lists them: isopropyl alcohol, ethanol, plastics, and glass. The presence of willing, non-union, Scotch-Irish, and English native workers added to their interest. Never mind that black soot was deposited on the dining room table each day, and the tall smokestacks with their spiral of dark smoke dominated the sky of an otherwise pristine river valley. Despite what seemed to me an idyllic childhood, as I got a little older, this is still Ralph, I knew one thing for certain. I had heard my mother's stories of Cleveland and the North, and that life was better there. I was going to leave West Virginia. I knew there were other places with more opportunities outside the state. I was going to leave and make something of myself. The only question that remained was how I was going to do it. At age 11, I found that I had a lot of energy and ambition. Some of us never reach that stage. But I did not look to express the energy at school. I could choose any other options, as I judged school to be 100% boring. Fortunately, as I was tall and people judged me to be much older than my age, I was able to find many opportunities outside of school. Money was always tight, so I wanted to earn my own way and become self-sufficient. Dad did not believe in giving allowances, and besides, I did not want to be dependent. From never-ending talk about the dinner table about financial shortages from the Depression, I knew there was not enough money to go around. Next, I wanted to build up my skinny body for sports. Indeed, he did. I put finding a good job as my first priority. I would then take on bodybuilding and sports, which indeed, as we saw, he did. Ralph recounts an early sporting event. Here's the event. I stood at the top of a snow-covered Tremont Hill, gripped the sides of my sled, and prepared to make my run on snow-crusted steep street. The street had gotten fast in snow, and now was the time to go. I sprinted down the hill, dove on my sled, and steered into the half-icy raceway. Suddenly, thump! I felt a second kid suddenly land on my back. I recognized my first-grade classmate, Emery Dameron. Emery had run along beside me, dived on, and spread-eagled over me to get a free ride down the hill, as little boys do. Seconds later, Walter Davis, much bigger, jumped on the two of us. With my running start and the weight of 2 extra riders, we quickly picked up speed. Halfway down the hill, we hit a sheet of ice. Everyone knew that you couldn't control a sled on ice. We were in for it. I tried to steer a straight course, but we began to fishtail at high speed. I knew that I would not be able to regain control of the sled. I felt completely helpless. When I cautiously tried to turn the sled towards the center of the street, our overloaded sked skidded in the opposite direction, towards the curb and several parked vehicles. Then we hit the truck. The paragraph ends with this comment: I could see my shin bone sticking through the skin. Ralph was in very great pain throughout what turned out to be an agonizing recovery from this accident. It involved the first of Ralph's 26 surgeries, most dramatically including a liver transplant many years later. Well, in accordance with the adage, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em, Ralph followed his dream to become a doctor and was brilliantly successful. He surmounted all his physical travails to have a great career, a lively intellectual life, and even considerable athletic success. Ralph is very much missed. We all envy his vigor and perseverance, his willingness to always dig deeper, and his gift for friendship. Requiescat in pace, Ralph.
So much of what I wanted to say has been covered, so I will be quite brief and just talk about the 3 years that I had with Ralph, which were, to say the least, very interesting, up and down. We didn't always agree about everything, particularly politics. We were very careful. He was very careful to avoid the topic. I sometimes lost it, and as he told his kids, we had 7 times. He counted them 7 times during our 3.5 years when we almost broke up, but he was very patient. We got back together. I just want to say he loved being at Carolina Meadows. He thought the people were the cream of the crop, the staff was outstanding, the food was the best ever, and he could not understand why I sometimes wanted to get off campus for a change. He kept saying how privileged we were to be here. He had only been here a year when we met. I had been here 10 and was getting pretty anxious to get off the campus. And he would say, okay, Vivienne, I'll spring you this Saturday night, and we would go out for dinner. One day toward the end, after playing croquet, which he loved, he waxed enthusiastic about being out in the sunlight with his friends. And incidentally, he mentioned with some satisfaction that he had won the match. Always the athlete, loving sports, he was competitive to the end. He would watch professional basketball happily all season. The last week of his life, knowing he had only a few days left, he called his children to come. He entertained his scheduled book club meeting. He enjoyed a last meal in the dining room with his family, and 2 days later died quietly in his sleep. I hope I am as privileged. Ralph was one of a kind, and we'll miss him. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for coming today to help us remember our father. I'm Dana Perry. I'm the 3rd child of Ralph, of the 4 of us. My charge today is to read a letter from his very close friend, Herb Gramm. He's unable to be with us today due to health issues. He's spending the winter in Tucson. So I'll just go ahead and read the letter. I've known Ralph, or Pug as he was called in those days, since 1959, when as an intern at Philadelphia General Hospital with plans to become a radiologist, I would consult with him on the x-rays of my patients. He was always ready to spend time reviewing the radiographic findings and explaining the intricacies of interpretation to me. I was impressed by his breadth of clinical knowledge and appreciated his suggestions of hope to further investigate abnormal findings. When it came to applying for a residency, he encouraged me to stay at Pittsburgh and facilitated my acceptance into the program. As much of the teaching in those days was provided by senior residents, I benefited greatly by being mentored by Ralph, who became a role model for me. My colleagues often made fun of me as a relative midget standing in front of a view box next to a giant like Ralph, referring to us as Mutt and Jeff. As we got to know each other better, I was invited several times to Ralph and Peggy's home in the suburbs, giving me the opportunity to get to know the family and enjoy the rare treat of a home-cooked meal. I still remember entering the house with Ralph after work one day, and Peggy appeared obviously distressed after a challenging day that was topped off by Chris having, who will speak next, Chris having dumped a couple of bottles of cleaning solution into the toilet. This is sent in two parts, so hold on one second, let me get the second part here. After returning from my 2 years abroad, where I served as radiologist in the Army stationed in Germany, I again connected with the Heinz family in the New York City area, where Ralph was training in neuroradiology at Columbia, and later in Connecticut when he was at Yale. During our busy professional lives, we only met occasionally at radiology meetings, as well as on a few social encounters in Pittsburgh and at our homes in Cambridge and Jaffrey. Fortunately, we had the opportunity to see each other more frequently after my nephew Tim settled in the Raleigh area, and Colette and I could combine a family visit with a stop in Chapel Hill, and of course, I couldn't miss the big birthday celebration with his family and friends. It was also fortuitous that Chris settled in Massachusetts, close to our summer home in New Hampshire, so that Ralph could combine a visit to both of us. I won't enumerate the many contributions Ralph has made to his chosen specialty of neuroradiology, which fortunately were explained in detail when he was awarded the second gold medal recently, which was a fitting finale to an outstanding career, well documented in the video that Chris produced. Ralph was not only a brilliant scientist, teacher, and clinician, but he was extremely well-read on many non-medical subjects and could carry on a highly erudite conversation on many political, sociological, and literary subjects. I've never had to resort to small talk on our phone calls or visits, but have always had a stimulating, wide-ranging conversation, even though we often disagreed on politics. Ralph was a truly loyal and reliable friend, and without a doubt, the most intelligent person that I knew. I will always value the time we spent together, even as recently as this spring when he volunteered to drive to Cary to visit with me and my sister. His passing will leave a large voice in my life. Herb Gramm.
My name is Dave Enterline, and Chris asked me to say a few words. I'm a neuroradiologist and chief of neuroradiology at Duke. I came from Chapel Hill and went down the road a little bit, and it was wonderful to meet Ralph in 1982. And I guess my first impression with Ralph was the depth of knowledge, the brilliance that he had, and the ability to communicate information. I think you've gotten the impression that Ralph is a great innovator and a wonderful teacher. And if we look at the number of lives that he has touched in the medical field, there were probably 700 trainees. But if you look at how each of those have influenced others, and the common procedures that have really resulted from all of his innovations are really astounding to think about, whether it's how do you evaluate children with seizures or adult with seizures, or interventional neuroradiology and all the new innovations with stroke. All of these came specifically from Ralph. You know, if you wanted to know about it, he would probably not say very much, but if you actually expressed a true interest, all of a sudden you found out, well, in 1964 this happened, in 1965 this happened, and all of a sudden you were into an hour-long conversation. I can imagine growing up with Ralph was challenging as a child. We all go through periods of time where we're trying to understand our parents, and but from a professional standpoint, he was just an absolute joy to work with and to be involved with. When Ralph got ready to retire, and we had at that time a mandatory retirement at age 70, Ralph approached our department and volunteered to teach for the several years, I forget whether it's 5 or 7 years afterwards. And he would come in several times a week and basically sit with our trainees and just tell them about what they needed to know and how to make themselves better professionally. That was a tremendous dedication on his part, but very characteristic of how he liked to do things. Being able to provide that additional information was just really at the heart of what he liked and how he did things. I remember when Tad was doing his fellowship, and he would meet with Ralph regularly and probably help look at the various ways of looking at plastic surgery, facial fractures, those sorts of things. I mean, that was just a wonderful experience. Ralph did not speak, boastfully in any way. He was really an individual who you had to express a true interest. Getting him to talk about his family was always challenging, but every once in a while, some glimmer of the pride that he had in the family would peek through, and it was wonderful to hear the way he talked about his family and children and grandchildren. When Ralph retired in 2004 from the teaching aspect, he then kind of all of a sudden found himself, looking for other things to accomplish. And he was very distressed that his financial planner hadn't done as good a job as he felt that person should have done. And so that was a challenge for Ralph, and he promptly came up with ways to beat the market repeatedly that were really astounding. And to listen to some of those things, you kind of say, well, how do you do that? And it takes probably several meetings to actually get to the understanding of, well, this is very simple. You just do it this way. And that was very much at the heart of how Ralph operated. Ralph got interested in croquet after retiring. And the thing that he really liked about croquet was calculating the angles and how to, it was not so much the athleticism, but just how do you figure out all the angles and how do you make it difficult for your opponent? And that was the essence of that. And I think one of the things that he really appreciated was coming to Carolina Meadows, the ability to meet with people and discuss items, and finally in learning duplicate bridge, not really having known much about it, and you all probably know a lot more about this. He was fascinated with this, and he kind of always admitted that he wasn't very good at it, but he was dedicated to learning things. I think the thing that Ralph had impressed me most is the ability and the innovation, the interest in kind of always learning new things is really a challenging endeavor. And being, with his family, and close was one of the things that he held to be very important to him. It was my pleasure to know Ralph. I know there's many people that he's touched in many, many, many ways. And I thank you very much for allowing me to share my thoughts.
Good morning. I'm Lindsey Cheadle. I am the youngest of Ralph's 4 children. So when my siblings and I started planning the service today, we were really determined that it'd be a celebration of my father and a chance for us all to gather and talk about what a vibrant person he was. He lived such a long and rich life, and as far as I can tell, he never wasted a single moment of it. So having said that, those of you who are familiar with the poem Invictus are probably wondering why I'm throwing a wrench into that festive mood and reading something that's so dark and intense as a Victorian poem about Stoicism that seems to be set against some kind of nightmarish hellscape. So one reason I chose Invictus was that my father loved this poem very much. And I have a very vivid memory. A few years ago, he called me on a Sunday evening, and he was very excited and energized. He'd just seen the film Invictus about Nelson Mandela. And he was really excited to talk about it. Often when we would talk on the phone, I would have trouble sleeping later that night because he had so many ideas to discuss in great depth, from politics to philosophy to history. And this evening was no exception. He told me that this poem really summed up his own philosophy on life, because he truly believed he was the master of his fate and the captain of his soul. And even though he wasn't a believer in organized religion, he was convinced the human soul is everlasting. And I certainly believe he had an unconquerable soul, and he has left an everlasting mark on this world. So that is a big lead up to what is actually a very short poem. This is Invictus by William Ernest Henley. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul.
Good morning. My name is Muki Fairchild, and I'm standing before you because 5 years ago, I got an email from Ralph asking me to meet with him at Whole Foods for one of our usual coffee get-togethers. He wrote that he wanted to ask me something. So we met, although neither of us ever drank coffee. I drank tea, and he sometimes drank water and sometimes nothing. We caught up on the usual topics, our writing, we were both writers, and what we were each reading, since he was an avid reader, as you've heard. My travels, I travel a lot, and he liked to hear where I was going, where I'd been. Family matters, mine and his. We studiously avoided politics since we were on opposite sides of that fence. But no request was made. And I didn't ask. I always waited for him to tell me whatever he wanted to tell me. Well, I went home, and later on that evening, a strange email popped up in my inbox. Ralph wrote that he wondered, he didn't know why he hadn't asked me what he wanted to ask me, but would I please say a few words at the time of his death? He said, and here he appeared to appeal to perhaps a little competitive spirit on my part. He said he was probably going to ask an additional person to speak. I think he meant you, John, but he wanted to ask me first, as I knew him in a profound way, he said, because of his memoir writing. Well, I have spoken at memorials before, but I've never gotten a request years in advance. And to say I was shocked was an understatement. I believe I jumped up from the computer, and oh my God was one of the milder things that came out of my mouth. After I composed myself, I sat back down and wrote Ralph and said, of course, I would be honored to say a few words, but I really hoped that his death would be a long, long way off and that he would enjoy many, many remaining years. And probably privately, I hoped he would forget all about this. But Ralph was very organized, and apparently he wrote something down and he didn't forget about it. Fortunately, he did have these 5 very happy years here at Carolina Meadows. So I'm going to tell you, first of all, not about his achievements, you've heard all about them, but about my initial impression of him, the very first time that I met him, the first time that I laid eyes on him 10 years ago in a memoir writing class given by Duke's Ollie. Ralph came into the classroom and folded all 6 feet 6 inches of himself, that tall, lanky, spare frame, into one of those very small, wooden, uncomfortable chairs in a classroom at the Bishop's house on Duke's East Campus. On that first day, we were given our instructions by the teacher. It was, each week, bring in enough copies of a portion of our story, whatever we were working on, to hand out to each class member in advance. And we were not to exceed 5 double-spaced pages typed in a 12-point Times New Roman font, which is a fairly legible font. Thus, if 8 people showed up, and there were usually about 10 people signed up in the class, you had 8 times 5, 40 pages of work to critique each week in advance. And we had equally explicit instructions on how to read, critique, and edit each page of each story. It's a lot of homework. Well, the following week and each subsequent week, Ralph arrived with a minimum of 15 pages, single-spaced, typed, with a font so small that I often felt I needed a magnifying glass to read each word. Photographs were a gift, and fortunately Ralph included photos of all the girls and women he had loved from high school on. And as some of you may know, he had an eye for beautiful women. Now, they didn't, I hasten to add, they didn't just have to be beautiful. They had to be very intelligent as well, and interesting. But the photographs, of course, showed the beauty. And we were very grateful for those photographs. He was a very, very diligent hard worker from early on, but it was not all work and no play. In writing class, however, he ignored, at first, subtle hints, and then outright requests to stick to the aforementioned guidelines. Why? He was on a mission, and as I learned, as he wrote and I read, not an hour and not a day was to be wasted. His mission was to write the story of his life, which meant braiding the personal and the professional parts together in a comprehensible way for a non-medical reader to understand and enjoy. And so I came to know Ralph first as a rule breaker, but isn't that how people like him, true pioneers, achieve what they do and what he did? Then as a writer, as someone who had impeccably high standards for himself, and then as a kind and compassionate human being whose critiques were among the most valued in the class. Reminiscing about Ralph these last few weeks with one of the members of that class long time ago, she told me that he had actually called her after the class because he was concerned that one of the critiques he'd written about her story, that she might have perceived it as too harsh, and he wanted to make sure that she understood what he had meant. And she said actually it wasn't harsh at all. And I remembered that sometime in that period I'd had a major surgery, and apparently the writing class got together and decided on, everybody was supposed to bring me a dinner every night. You know how people get together and do that. And Ralph, apparently, one of his skills was not cooking. But one night the doorbell rang on his night, I guess. The doorbell rang, and there stood Ralph with a roasted chicken in a plastic bag that he had just stopped and bought at the local grocery store, holding it like this. And he dropped it off, didn't stay, walked off. So that is a kindness that I shall always remember. That has nothing to do with the writing. But through his writing, and then through our many talks outside the classroom, as our friendship blossomed, I came to know about his endless intellectual curiosity about the world and its people like myself. I'm a first-generation New York liberal Jew. His intense, unwavering loyalty to his friends and his family, and above all, his courage. The limitless courage it took him to face and struggle through the many obstacles in his life. I want to close by reading a paragraph from his memoir that summarizes Ralph and his attitude towards his life and why I came to respect and admire him so much, and why I already miss him in our meetings so much. And fortunately, John, you and I picked different readings. I started to worry when you started reading from his memoir, but he wrote, "I have been blessed simply to be alive after my liver transplant. Thanks to these wonderful doctors, I was able to continue my clinical, medical, and investigative career for 18 additional years after my liver transplant at age 60. Life is so precious. Life is so very beautiful. We must treasure every moment, even the painful ones. When I was told I was going to die from my liver disease, I thought about missing all bright yellows and reds and earth tones of fall, but most importantly, I thought about missing all the warmth of my family and my friends, fellows and students who have given me the blessing of their friendship and their caring. Having been saved, I feel content that I tried to give back whatever I had to offer. Knowing that I had given what I had and that I had left very little on the table gives me contentment at the end. Life is meant to be spent assertively. As D.H. Lawrence said, life is meant to be spent, not saved." Thank you.
So I'll be the last speaker, and afterwards we have a simple reception, and we'd like to hear from people about their memories of Ralph, if you have the patience to stay a few minutes. So my dad is loving this. I want to continue the theme of a celebration of his life, that, like Lindsey said. So there is a strong feeling of grief, absolutely, but it's pure and simple feeling. Few people realize that he was in constant pain, which was rapidly progressing in recent months. So the grief is well balanced by a sense of relief. He was ready to go. So there's really no need for the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief. There's just one: acceptance. Hearing all the speakers today have so many different angles on my dad. He was a complex man. He was multifaceted, multidimensional. I learned a lot about my dad in the weeks before and after he died. I felt like he was there with me as I went through his files. And believe me, he had files. He was the epitome of a self-made man. Child of the Depression, battled his way through a hard-scrabble youth. People have alluded to this, so bear with me. He told me that at age 11, he decided he wanted to become a great man. He wasn't sure what that meant yet, but he set goals and showed tremendous discipline, a pattern that would continue throughout his life. You've heard about the liver transplant. It was a near-death experience since organ rejections were still fairly common. He scheduled it once he learned that a new anti-rejection compound had proven effective in Japan. This was based on an extract of blowfish, of all things, a delicacy that would poison you if not prepared properly. Dr. Raven, as chairman at the time, said last night that Ralph asked for 2 weeks off for a liver transplant. He was expecting him to not return or return part-time in a diminished capacity. But my dad bowled through it, and he came back strong. And after a few short weeks, and it wasn't 2 weeks, but it was 3 or 4, but he went back and acted as if nothing had ever happened. He was very private about his health, which is why a lot of people in Carolina Meadows were surprised to hear that he had passed. But he had a complicated set of medical conditions. He underwent 29 surgeries in his life, mostly his knees and his back. He experienced constant pain, especially in the last few years. I learned this the last week he was alive. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being severe, the pain grew from a 2 to a 4 over the last year, then from a 4 to a 6. He took medication to feather it back to a pain level of 4, which consider that like a splitting headache or major aches and pains from rheumatoid arthritis. He never complained. He did not talk about that. It was like it was his personal business, and he didn't want to like put his mishigas and an organ recital on others. People have heard the term organ recital. Okay. The time of his death is a remarkable coincidence and a fact. He died on November 11th. The sheriff logged the time of death as 11:11 a.m. Some coincidence. He died at 11:11 on 11/11. The odds of this, my son calculated today for me, 525,600 to 1. I round this up to 1,000,000 to 1. He was 1 in 1,000,000. November 11th was also the 100th anniversary of Armistice Day, now Veterans Day. The pact was signed at 11 a.m. in 1918. Think about this. The Great Peace after the Great War. A metaphor for my dad's life. So taking off on the number ones, I'll go through this quickly as I can. Number 1, All-State in high school basketball, a giant amongst the Lilliputians. Ralph dunks again. He, self-made, built him up. Number 2, number 1 in bodybuilding. He studied nutrition, all-protein heavy diet, the original Atkins diet when it hadn't been invented. Somehow he figured it out. Lots of protein. He bulked up from 160 pounds to 230 pounds in 1 year while lifting weights, and you saw the picture. That enabled him to excel in basketball and led to his scholarships and future success. Number 3, class president, first year at Penn Medical School. I found a campaign card in his files. It said simply, Ralph Heinz, athlete, scholar, gentleman. He got elected. Brief side tour on this. Yesterday afternoon, Dr. Provenzale hosted a tribute event for Dad at Duke. About 25 doctors attended, and 3 spoke about him. They revealed a side of him that we had never known. All three spoke about what a gentleman he was, how smart he was, how grateful they were as colleagues. Afterwards, most of the attendees spoke to me, Lindsey, and Vivienne about how he mentored them, how quickly he found the best way to impart his knowledge in a way they would understand. He didn't talk at them, he didn't talk down to them, he talked with them and followed these cues and got to the heart of the matter. And how patient he was and how much they respected him for it. Another file had over 100 letters from trainees and fellows that he had mentored and thanking him for being their mentor and how much it meant to them. Number ones, this is the fourth one for those tracking. The femoral artery method, you've heard about it. I'm gonna skip most of this, but to me the importance was the quality of medical care, and as Dr. Provenzale alluded to, this ripple effect of his knowledge, rippling out to his trainees, through their trainees, around the world to become the best practice in clinical health. And in my mind, that translates to hundreds of thousands of patients who experienced better medical care, maybe millions, probably millions. So I'm really proud of that. And in tandem with that, I'm really proud of him for being the Teacher of the Year. He was elected by his trainees and fellows. That is just super, I think. That was one of the things I liked the best, to be elected best teacher. And he could do and teach, not just teach, or not just do. He was a good teacher, excellent teacher. The gold medal awards, one thing that I want to mention in terms of singularity, he was the only doctor to win 2 gold medal awards, where one of them was in the overall special field of neuroradiology, what he called the whole waterfront, and the second was in a subdiscipline, subspecialty, which was pediatrics. The other 2 had won 2 gold medals, were all both in pediatrics. So he covered the waterfront. He had to back in the early days, and he developed the waterfront. Number 6, investments. You heard he was a trader. This is unbelievable. In 2015, between 2015 and 2018, he had doubled his money in the stock market. He had meager financial holdings, and he doubled it. And that was even allowing for withdrawals for his living expenses. You all know how expensive it is at Carolina Meadows. In fact, I found a statement from the Q1 of this year where he showed it being up 53% in 3 months. I was like, how did you do that? Can you teach me? But this is what he did. He took on things. He had this index card method. He's thousands of index cards just on stocks, signals, what to look for, what not to do. Paper clipped and stapled and rubber banded. And I think of this as the precursor to the hierarchical database in digital. This was the analog database invented by him. Statistics show that 19 out of 20 people, 95% of day traders lose money. My dad was one of 20. First as at Carolina Meadows to excel at both croquet and bridge. Again, more than 100 index cards each. Again, largely self-taught. Finally, number 8, the first and only father his children have. Honestly, our family life was not always a bed of roses, but Dad persisted. And I, at least, am honored to have received 50% of my genes from him. I am also relieved I didn't get 100%. I basically would have exploded under the pressure. Dad was a father, but also a friend to me. At one point, a coach. Had a terrible stretch 10 years ago, and coupled with the Great Recession, my life sounded like a country song. Got laid off, broke my back, got divorced, lost most of the rest of my money, and my dog died. The only thing missing was a pickup truck up on blocks in the driveway. My dad supported me emotionally in an unconditional way. He coached me in my job search and in personal areas of self-improvement. He was very perceptive. He just could sense things. The week before he died, he spent a lot of time with his 4 kids. He told me with 20/20 hindsight, that's spelled H-E-I-N-Z, that I am an extrovert living in the lifestyle of an introvert. Well then, you know what? You're right. Why am I doing that? I said, somebody moved my cheese. I'm out in the boondocks in Massachusetts. I'm 40 miles from Boston. He then said, to do something new, you have to stop doing something old. This had a profound effect on me, and I'm now taking steps to move forward with conviction. I have a job close to Boston, and I'm moving close to Boston. Only 10 more pages. Just kidding. Dad also had a great sense of humor. We would take turns handing each other Dilbert comics and watching for the reaction. He would often break into an extended belly laugh that would get me going, and we giggled for minutes like we were school children. He had a great sense of humor. He wrote the punchline of jokes on index cards and took turns with certain friends who loved jokes, telling them for hours. I'm looking for the file of jokes. I still haven't found it. The 4 kids got together for his 70th birthday and gave him a roast in front of a dozen or so good friends. The theme, a takeoff on the big E. His name was Edward Ralph Heinz. He wrote it as E. Ralph Heinz. So we called him the Big E at times when we wanted to tease him and get a rise out of him. So we made up definitions of words starting with the letter E, and I'm not going to go through a bunch, but I have a couple. Enumerate. The kids, we had a list where we would track our chores against our allowance, and so we had to enumerate our contributions, in which case we would get recompensed with an allowance. There was no free lunch with him. We were well off, but he didn't want to raise a bunch of sissies. And the further so that led me to understand my first glimpse of dual entry accounting at age 11. And making a living, preparing to learn how to make a living. An e-missive was a dreaded letter from him that would come in a blue envelope with this little tiny scrawl and be 5 pages of tiny scrawl to decipher as like hieroglyphs. But he often had a lot of cool things to say, and ultimately I kept them and I value them. Elaborate. The doctors at Duke spoke of how he could go on and on. So he would elaborate if given the floor, kind of like I'm doing now. But the doctor said last night, he wanted to get his advice, but it was Friday at about 4:30, and he kind of wanted to get home to his wife. And he knew if he went to Dad then, that he wouldn't be home till like 6:30. So he decided, it'll wait till Monday. So another E word, edicts, edict. He told me several sayings that resonate with me. 1, to truly succeed, hire people smarter than you and share your vision. That sets his ego aside. That let him accomplish much more than he would have on his own. Number 2, if you value a friend, extend yourself more than 50%. Otherwise, they drift into an acquaintance, and from there, somebody that you used to know, which I think is really good. Number 3, tackle the hardest project of your day early in the day, which I have done, and I tell you, it's such a good thing to do because it relieves anxiety. And anyway. 4th, keep a chocolate bar in your desk for the afternoon doldrums. So wrapping up, I truly believe he did achieve his goal. He was a great man. He was a good father, not perfect, but I'm very proud to be his son. One more word, eternal. His accomplishments, innovations, leadership, teaching led to better healthcare for millions around the world. So please indulge me in this if you are willing. Please join me in a round of applause for my dad's life in celebration. Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming, and we'd like to see you at the reception and back if you have time.
give up.